Welcome to Invest Well, Be Well, a podcast for wiser investing and stronger living. I'm Rusty Vanneman, longtime investment professional, and I'm joined each week by my co-host, Robin Murray.
Thanks, Rusty. I'm a storyteller and journalist, and I am so excited to explore the ideas, insights, and people shaping the intersection of performance and purpose.
This podcast is for thoughtful investors and driven professionals who want to grow in their portfolios and in their personal lives.
We'll talk long-term investing, behavioral finance, personal development, and what it takes to live and work with intention.
So let's get started. Let's invest well and be well together.
This podcast is brought to you by Main Management LLC. Since 2002, Main has been recognized as an ETF strategist that combines an institutional process with the personalized service of a boutique firm.
Invest Well, Be Well is also sponsored by State Street Investment Management. Founded as a pioneer in ETFs, State Street Investment Management, through its SPDR brand, brought the first U.S. ETF to market with a SPDR S&P 500 ETF trust, commonly known by its ticker symbol, SPY.
Our guest today is Joe Smith, Chief Investment Officer at Parti Pris and a good friend of both of ours. We had an awesome conversation.
You're right. Today we were joined by someone I've had the privilege of working closely with over the years, Joe Smith. He was once the deputy CIO, my deputy CIO at CLS Investments, where he quickly distinguished himself as a disciplined investor, a clear thinker, and really one of the best risk management minds I've worked with. Over the course of his career, he's also had senior roles across the investment and ETF ecosystem, including at Russell Investments and Charles Schwab. And as you mentioned, he's now the co-founder and CIO of Parti Pris Investment Partners. Joe has spent his entire career at the intersection of portfolio construction, personalization, and thoughtful risk management. And as we hear in this interview at Parti Pris, he's building a platform that helps financial advisors deliver truly personalized household-level portfolios in a way that's both practical and scalable. He's also a big believer that culture is a competitive edge for investment firms, something I happen to agree with, and the right culture leads to better decisions and better outcomes for investors. And beyond all that, Joe lives a stronger living side of the podcast as well. He's an entrepreneur, a former athlete, and he's a devoted family man, and he's navigating the realities of building a firm while raising a young family with a high-achieving spouse. What were your takeaways?
Well, it's always good to see Joe and always good to hear his insights. As you said, he's just got a brilliant mind, and it's always interesting to hear what he has to say. It was great to hear about his experience as an entrepreneur. He's such a quantitative guy, so it was kind of cool to hear some of his qualitative insights from his experience going through that process. Talked about seeing your client as your co-pilot, which was a good insight there, a little nugget. He talked, of course, about the importance of taking taxes into consideration, which is such a complicated subject, and he really goes through that and explains that. And as he said, on the stronger living side, he's got a little 3-year-old at home, and it's kind of turning him into slightly less of a work machine, finding that work-life balance. And yeah, just interesting in seeing how he's navigating all that.
I don't know if I believe all of that. I mean, he is just a machine when it comes stuff out. But, my big takeaways, well, first of all, the topic of direct indexing, which is one of the hottest topics in the investment world right now, this is a great podcast for you. You'll learn a lot about, what it is and why it's important. He also talked about culture, which of course I always love riffing on that topic, which I think is so important. And sort of a little bonus at the end, we do dive into a little bit of college football. He's very passionate about it, being a former college football player himself. Though I did find, even though he gave some pretty fun answers, he was a little restrained because I know he can give a much more passionate response to a couple of my questions. But nonetheless, it was still fun to ask him.
All right, great. Well, let's take a listen. Joe, it's so good to see you. Welcome to the show. Welcome to Invest Well, Be Well.
Thank you, Robin, for having me. It's great to see you guys again. It's been a while. Rusty, good to see you, as always.
Nice to see you, Joe. It's definitely been a while. You were a guest on our prior podcast, and of course, we know you way beyond just the podcast as well. And in our new podcast format, there's one thing we still do the same, and that is we ask for a walk-up song. We need to figure out what kind of energy are we going to have in this interview. So, Joe, what is your walk-up song?
Yeah, so this time around, I'm going to give you a brand new one, which is Lupe Fiasco, The Show Goes On. And what I love about that song is that it really kind of reflects what I feel has been my entrepreneurial experience for the last 6 years. So, start out with the new business. Hey, I have the problem I really want to go solve. One, you're never 100% sure like it's actually going to work. Number two, I think it takes a lot of perseverance, right, to kind of work through all the setbacks and, opting over your no or whatnot. But, I think for me personally, what I love about that song is just that it's just all through everything and, getting to where you want to be. So that's my walk-up song. Has a great beat as well. So my current jam I've been, jamming on the last couple of weeks.
That is perfect, and it sets up some future questions.
All right. Well, Joe, Rusty and I, of course, know all about you and your professional journey. But for our listeners, tell us where you're coming from and what you're doing today at Parti Pris.
Yeah, so kind of a little bit of my journey is I've been all over the map. So I've done everything from product development, I've been a portfolio manager, a deputy CIO, and now I've jumped into the wealth tech space to solve what I think is an important problem, which is really how do people actually manage for taxes and risks simultaneously when they're talking about wealth across an entire household. So what I love about my journey is that I definitely have had the benefit of just kind of seeing the investment world and financial services world from a lot of perspectives, both institutional, more so also focused on the wealth management side as well. And I think the commonality when you work with a lot of people in this space overall is everyone's just really passionate about what they do, and especially working with clients. And, my passion, associated with that is really just, having the ability to find better solutions for them that, help to lead to better conversations and better outcomes with their clients over time.
Right. So I think you kind of set me up for my next question, but let's just focus on and isolate it. But in simple terms, what is the exact problem that Parti Pris is solving for advisors and their clients?
Yeah, in very, very simple terms, I think that Rusty is, investors today, I think as they go along their investment journey, one of the key items that comes up is how much they're paying in taxes every year, right? And that can be a very convoluted answer, right, based on kind of what solution they're using or what model they may be invested in, et cetera. And so, we're really all about helping investors keep more of what they earn, especially when more of their wealth profile is at risk. And for the advisor, I think what's important for us is we're just trying to deliver technology that simplifies their day-to-day to organize client accounts, manage and trade client accounts, and really kind of think about that intersection between risk and taxes as kind of leading to better outcomes and better conversations with their clients over time.
Yeah, that sounds great. Yeah. I kind of expected that answer, but in my opinion, you are a risk manager extraordinaire. You didn't even touch upon risk, but we're going to ask you plenty of questions on risk later. So before we dive deeper into Parti Pris, what is your Parti Pris? In other words, what is the core design idea behind your own investing philosophy today?
Yeah, it's funny because I think about that question relative towards what it might have been like even 5 years ago, right? And it certainly has changed or evolved. It hasn't changed. It's more so evolved than anything else. So number one, I think what's most important is that, it is the journey, right? And the destination that matters for a lot of investors. And so being able to get there has a lot of uncertainty that comes along with it. And, you have to really make sure that you have the right tools, the right people, the right process in place to kind of manage the bumps and kind of bruises along the way that may come with that. Hopefully more so bumps than bruises. The second thing, which, I think our industry it's great that this conversation is coming up more and more, but taxes really do matter, right? They can eat into kind of your wealth over time, right? If you're not careful in terms of how you manage them. And so I think that's a very big kind of even more important forefront than it might have been 5 years ago in the way I thought about kind of how all this comes together. And, I think the third thing too is that, the, let's call it overall kind of approach to the markets hasn't really changed as much, but I do think that what advisors ran into, in terms of kind of the clients that we work with, it's now all about thinking about, okay, hey, what's my valuations that are important to me in the marketplace? What's the risk I'm taking or not taking relative towards the client? And then what are the things that also matter to them in terms of their life journey and kind of how they want to be able to take those assets and do the things that are important to them. So for me, my philosophy is kind of updated a little bit to say, hey, you really kind of have to be very sensitive towards some of those areas. And some of those are a little bit more qualitative than probably, my brain historically has worked. But I think the benefit that I often see is that those are often the little things that, create small wins for advisors, especially when it comes towards the type of conversations they're able to have than, what they've done historically.
So, Joe, from your experience now, many years leading multi-asset portfolios, what do you think are some sort of non-negotiable principles of wise long-term investing?
So I will tell you, Robin, first off, and this has not changed over time, is that I think that when people talk about philosophy, process, people, right, 5 or 6 Ps, however you want to define them from a due diligence standpoint, those all remain extremely important, right? Because I think what is interesting, and I'll kind of share this perspective in terms of just even some of my younger friends these days, I think with the rise of AI and just kind of what you can do with that, what's starting to get lost in the conversation is really kind of the need for advice from professionals who really know kind of how to organize kind of what you're doing or what you want to accomplish in a way that's going to be systematically repeatable and there can be some level of accountability in terms of the decisions that are being made. So, people, philosophy, process, all of that I think still reigns supreme when it comes towards long-term investing in multi-asset portfolios. I think the second thing that really comes into focus is understanding kind of what's the most important risk that needs to be managed. We all may, in kind of in the investment world, think about that. Oh, that's tracking error, that's drawdown, that's all these other things. But I think the single biggest risk that the advisor cares about working with the client is, are they really just going to have enough money to live off of their assets, or think about philanthropy, think about other dreams that they may want to pursue at some point in their lives? And if you don't have enough money to do those things, it certainly can change kind of the decision making that you may have with your advisor. And then, I think the last thing I'll say too is that from my vantage point, at least, what's also important in terms of kind of that long-term view is really seeing the client, right? If you're an advisor, as almost like your co-pilot on that journey, right? So, historically, I think a lot of us have focused on the delivery of a model portfolio and just saying, hey, this is kind of a one and done answer for you as the client. But now with kind of I don't want to call it rise of personalization because people are doing it for so long, but the technology to make it scalable and delivered in a consistent way, I think it presents a lot of opportunities for advisors to, have the, their clients as a part of the discussion on the portfolio design, kind of how things work in terms of implementation, and really just getting them invested in the ownership behind kind of the decisions that are being made as well.
So I want to ask you about diversification as well. How do you define and measure true diversification at the household level?
So it's interesting because, and Rusty, I know the first thing he would probably think about is it's a risk budget. It always starts and ends with a risk budget. And I think that's still true, right? From my vantage point, and just to kind of put this in more simple terms, is that I think where the industry, where we've gone, is that we've been all about dividing up your assets and managing and reporting on your assets separate, right? Especially in the context of like a unified managed account or UMA. And, what's great about that approach is that it makes it very clean for the client to understand what they own, why it performed the way it did, and over time kind of understand like why are certain changes being made at different points of time, especially using different managers. One of the things that I think that householding kind of introduces is taking that concept and saying, well, those things could be important because they still may represent the different pieces or elements of what your client owns or kind of, what's important in terms of their wealth. But householding kind of brings it, to the point to say, hey, we can still look over the fence and identify whether or not you own a little bit too much of something, too little of something, while also being able to say, hey, we can start thinking about some of those trade-offs also while thinking about your taxes, right? So I know for my personal experiences with my investment assets is that I could have, a capital gain realized from selling a security, right? but that decision may not always contribute to something else that might be happening in my portfolio or even in my life, right? I, might have sold my home or something else, and that equally has a tax implication. And so what I think is important is really, householding kind of provides, and we'll talk about kind of the idea of householding in a second, but I think kind of the idea of bringing everything into one place and then being able to account for it, right, as you're making trade decisions really kind of simplifies the advisor's life. It simplifies the client's life because they're not thinking about, okay, how much might I own or will I owe to the IRS at some point in time? It's just very clear as like, here's how your taxes are being managed, and here's how we're thinking about all of your assets in one place.
All right, I got to go back to risk management. You already touched upon it. So I know this is a topic you could talk about for, 5 seconds, 5 minutes, 5 hours, 5 days. You could talk about risk management. And you already gave a perfect answer for what risk is, and that's not meeting future liabilities and just the security of knowing if you don't have enough. But I want more meat on the bones. So
Sure. Yeah.
What tools do you think matter the most for real clients? Is it controlling drawdowns? Is it the tax budgeting? Is it tracking your guardrails? In other words, how much do you deviate from benchmarks? Give us some more detail about risk management. What do you think is truly important?
Yeah. So, Rusty, as I've been thinking about this question, there's something else that I think from a risk management standpoint, we don't talk enough about, which is what goes into the actual, selection of a model or asset allocation for the client, right? Because that's really where it starts. Like if you're not aligning the portfolio to kind of, what's going to be the best representation for the client to get from point A to point B, it's all that other stuff just kind of becomes secondary, right? Now, why do I say that though? So one of the things I think, just to give it more concretely is, one of the things we see with a lot of our clients today is that they're having a lot more discussions around model and index selection, just given the current state of the markets as of this date, right? So if you were to look at, for example, like the Russell 1000, and said, hey, what does my top 10 in terms of those names represent for the whole index, right? You would see it's probably almost about half of the total index itself. And for advisors, I think kind of our clients, as they work with advisors, that it comes up because the first question they're asking is like, okay, hey, do I really want that to be kind of the key driver of my entire portfolio? Is there other ways to diversify that? Should I be thinking about taking on more of that risk because I may not be exposed enough to it in terms of kind of the market, et cetera? And so, from my vantage point, I think that's actually an area that more and more folks probably don't give as much credence to, right? We kind of think about it, okay, hey, it's a process, we do it and we move on. But, when things get really kind of dislocated in the marketplace, like both in terms of certain things going down, certain things kind of appreciating it in a very short amount of time, I think it becomes a very critical piece towards how people want to think about the risks that are important to take or not take for their clients, right? The second thing I'll say as well, and again, I could talk about this all day, is that taxes is an important risk, right? Because I think it's not just so much controlling kind of the outcome of how much you may be paying in taxes, but I think it's a really critical tool towards managing for investment behavior, right? So not having the client say, hey, I can't deal with this, I'm out, like this is not for me. I think the idea of kind of tax budgeting or thinking about taxes really serves as kind of a risk control that has more to do with helping the client stay tried and true towards kind of the overall investment approach and journey as well.
So you kind of touched upon something there. I want to follow up on this.
Yeah.
How do I ask the question? But so you talked about investor behavior. We've also been talking about sort of the science of risk management. And how do you think behavior and process intersect? And I guess the ultimate question is, how do you design portfolios that investors can actually stick with?
Yeah, so from my vantage point, and this kind of even goes into the name Parti Pris, right? I know we probably might have touched on that or not in the past, but if you think about kind of in architecture, right? The idea of a Parti Pris for most architects is like, it's the design before the design, right? What's going to organize the thought in terms of kind of what ultimately gets put on paper as a blueprint or, how they want to go about, building something, right, that's going to have a deeper meaning to it in terms kind of a building itself. And, when we talk about the idea of, what our technology does for advisors, it's really putting in that seat to, organize kind of, the portfolio in a way that's going to be more consistent with, the client's own individual needs, as well as still, meeting the intent behind kind of the investment strategy itself, right? And I think that's absolutely, if I was to compare to like 10 years ago, right? I think that's one of the biggest things that's now presented itself as an opportunity for advisors working with clients is you don't have to kind of think of a model anymore as being kind of, one size fits all for your clients, right? It can be, hey, it's a starting point. It's a great starting point, but we can craft and tailor it in a way that allows for it to accommodate for, a whole range of interest or pain points, right? That, investors may be feeling.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to ask you, as you said, you've been an entrepreneur for the last 5 or 6 years. So tell us about how that experience has impacted some of the way that you think, right? Like, what's a belief that you held 6 years ago before you got started that you've updated, and what changed your mind?
Yeah, so I'll give kind of an industry answer, and then I'll give kind of my personal my personal experience answer as well. So 6 years ago, when I decided, hey, I'm going to go, do my own thing, start a business, be focused in this area to, solve this problem in the, what was then the direct indexing space. My view or belief was that the idea of like ETFs or mutual funds would be massively disrupted by the idea of like unbundling what's largely been bundled in package form. Fast forward the clock, right? I think what's actually occurred is that some of that activity is a part of the discussion, but I think more of it is how do I actually go about using technology to really better facilitate which building blocks are appropriate for what situation towards building out a portfolio that isn't necessarily geared towards the exact replication of a client's investment model or asset allocation, but rather, hey, it can generally be designed in a way to reflect the behavior, right? To be in the neighborhood of the portfolio without necessarily one having to truly match every single model weight, and as well as be very clever towards working around what a client may own, but could be a little bit cumbersome for them to sell because of tax reasons. So that's kind of been my interesting observation 6 years later. I will say that's changed my perspective. I think the second thing too that I'll just go to kind of my own personal experience is that as an entrepreneur, you learn pretty quickly to fail fast and pivot. And I think that's, for me, been very important because 6 years ago, we were ultimately became a registered RA to focus on just, simply outsourcing direct indexing as a solution. And as we, kept working with, a number of, whether it's advisors or wealth management organizations, TAMPs, et cetera, I think what we figured out is like, hey, one of the biggest problems was just simply a lot of these organizations didn't have the right technology to go about doing this in a scalable and consistent way that, one, didn't require for them to hire more bodies to do it, and two, didn't require chewing into more time that they would have probably preferred to spend with clients. And so, personally for myself, right, understanding that, pivots actually do occur, right? And you never really start off with your original kind of thought process on what you wanted to do. But the great thing is when you do pivot, it's often because you identify there's a more kind of determinate need that needs to be addressed.
Yeah. I do love that lesson about pivoting. I mean, quite frankly, that works in the corporate world as well. But all right, so listeners, I need to warn you here. The next 4 questions are a little more technical. So I know that some people are listening to this podcast and they know it's about direct indexing or Parti Pris, or they know Joe Smith is on, and so they want to dive deeper. So we got 4 questions here, and I know if you're on various platforms, podcast platforms, you could skip the next couple of questions if you wanted to. So a little more technical stuff, and we got to get back into Parti Pris. So walk us through a workflow on Parti Pris? And and as a result of all this, where are the biggest advisor time savings?
Yeah. So for Parti Pris and our platform, Advisor Wealth Design, think of it as today for whether you're an RIA, a family office, an advisor who works with a TAMP, one of the biggest things you run into often is that when taxes are involved, it can be a pretty labor-intensive process to figure out what you want to do, right? And think about that issue as going from just dealing with individual accounts for a client to saying, I've now got to do that for 6 or 7 accounts they have with me, and I've got to do all this before year end, right? And so the workflow that we've created or crafted really is all about, one, making it very simple for the advisor to communicate on the design and kind of setup stage. Okay, what is it I want to do, right? How do I go about selecting a model? How do I personalize the account for the thing or the portfolio if it's a household for the things that are going to be important for my client? How do I, set up a tax strategy that is going to be very advantageous on reaching a sensible outcome in terms of transitioning the portfolio, but still being mindful of like how sensitive my client might be towards writing a check to the government, right, on day one versus going forward. And then ultimately, how do I take that information and make sure it gets implemented in a way that I'm not sitting there trying to chase my tail, if you will. I'm looking at tax lot level data on my accounts, every time the market drops or, when I need to get cash reinvested, et cetera. So we look at the workflow as really, one, empowering the advisor to make a lot of those choices in a very simple way. And two, on the back end, more often than not for our clients, taking the technology and then automating those decision points around, how trades get generated, what types of trades in terms of the areas of focus. They could be a lot more focused on managing the risks relative towards the model or investment selection if it's an index, versus thinking about the deployment of their tax budget versus how they even may want to deal with cash flows, right, in a tax-friendly way. So, what I think has been great about our process is that rather than kind of just, building something and then putting it out there, a lot of what we've done has been, frankly, years of, consulting and working with both small and large wealth management organizations to really understand, like, where do they find kind of parts where the process breaks for them, right? And how can we come up with something that can alleviate that pain for them and again, just get them back towards saving time and focusing on working with clients or in certain cases also working with other advisors as well.
Yeah. All right. If you go to the website for Parti Pris, but it has a very clean look and some nice demos in there. There are a couple terms that are mentioned there, and I want to ask what they are and how they help simplify personalized household portfolios. And they are Advisor Sketchbook and Advisor Wealth Design. What are they?
Yeah. So I'll start with Advisor Wealth Design. Think of Advisor Wealth Design as just kind of the overarching platform itself, right? So it contains everything between, the user experience that we deliver called Advisor Sketchbook for the advisor to do their portion of the work. Advisor Wealth Design also contains the engine or tax-aware optimization capability that will drive how the portfolios get rebalanced or updated through time. And then, there's a third piece, what we call kind of, effectively just a model manager. And that's everything about what models or index options or a blend of everything that I want to represent as a part of kind of, the choices I can give the advisor to select from. And I think, again, not to get too technical, but I think kind of if someone was to say, hey, why'd you guys build it this way? Like, what was the point? And I think it was the idea or concept that for a lot of, RIAs or wealth management organizations, portfolio management historically has been fairly decentralized when it comes to this type of work, right? It's kind of, I work with a investment manager, they kind of handle 1 or 2 accounts. I'm not really kind of in control of driving that. I'm just a participant. And I think what we recognize is that in order to do this well and to make sure it's scalable for the advisors so they can spend more time with their clients, a lot of this stuff needs to have both centralization of kind of the activity, especially with how the portfolios are being generated and traded, as well as a sense of control for the advisor who really knows the client best, right? And wants to be the pilot, if you will, in some way, in terms of kind of what's the design, how it gets, being able to give instructions on how it should be implemented, and then ultimately also how it may be monitored, right? Tax loss harvesting, as a perfect example. I think tax loss harvesting for certain advisors can mean something very different than other advisors, right? And so, we're all about making sure there's flexibility in the context of our platform to allow for that choice if you're working with 2 different or 3 different distinct advisors, if you will.
This episode of Invest Well, Be Well is brought to you by Main Management LLC, a pioneer in actively managed ETFs since 2002. Main Management starts with a clear fiduciary focus, delivering the transparency and personal attention you'd expect from a boutique firm. They provide financial advisors with solutions, not products. Main also believes investors should keep more of what they earn, emphasizing net of fee after-tax performance to help clients retain more of their returns. I've known Main Management for years. I've met thousands of managers over the course of my career, and one quality I really value: they invest alongside their clients. They eat their own cooking. Over 10% of the assets they manage are their own partner assets, and more than half of the firm are partners themselves. That says a lot. To learn more about Main strategies, including buy right hedged equity, U.S. sector rotation, thematic innovation, and all asset models, please visit their website at mainmgt.com.
Can you walk us through, if you have an RIA that's starting from model portfolios and ETFs, what's sort of a pragmatic 90-day path into that household level personalization that you're talking about?
Yeah, well, so I think, Robin, what I say is important with that. One is, I think there's a choice or decision that the advisor or the firm that might be evaluating, think about this, might be making, right? And it has more to do with how do we either, one, create a greater share of wallet with each client, right? And or 2, how do we think about a different way to approach risk management and placing taxes as a part of that decision as well? From my vantage point, at least, one of the things that is being talked about, probably doesn't get picked up enough, it's just frankly, this whole expected, generational transfer in wealth that we're expecting in the next couple of decades. So I think the last study I saw is, $80 trillion expected to transfer between baby boomers and, folks in our generation, whether it's millennials, Gen X, Gen Y, Gen Z, et cetera. And I think one of the biggest things with that, and I've seen, a number of kind of more recent articles and studies on this, is that, I think a lot of advisors are kind of expecting that the children of those clients, of their current clients today, most likely wouldn't plan to work with them, right? They don't feel that they would be able to have an effective relationship with them. And where I kind of look at it is actually, well, hey, what's great about this idea of householding, right? You're talking about families, like family matters, right? And it creates a great way for not only the reintroduction of the advisor to each member of the family, each generation of the family, but makes the planning and succession process, if you will, if you want to call it that, a little bit easier, right, for all parties involved. So I think for, again, some of the things that are going to be important with this going forward are really more about how does this, from our vantage point as a technology, how does this create time savings, right, for the advisor? Because doing this, a lot of family offices do this today. It's hours of work. It is literally hours of work or weeks of work in some instances. But I think the benefit that a lot of advisors are going to be able to get out of it is it's just a different conversation, right? It's a different conversation that's more inclusive of, not just simply the primary client, but really kind of everybody that might be impacted by the decisions that are being made with that wealth profile.
And are there metrics that firms can use to track how this is working and to show personalization is actually creating better client outcomes?
Yeah, so I always go back and forth on this because, and I'll kind of give you, some metrics that we see, right, in terms of, is this something that is worth pursuing relative towards our platform? So I think number one, when we hear from our clients, if I was to say, when we first launched the platform itself a little bit over, 14 or 15 months ago, our clients were highly focused on direct indexing, single individual accounts, equity only style portfolios. Fast forward the clock, I think 2/3 of any new proposal generation we typically see are dedicated towards being unified managed households in a multi-asset framework. And what's interesting about that as well is that for our clients and the advisors, when they win mandates, those mandates probably, again, compared to our own data 12 months ago, those mandates 12 months ago might have been maybe about 3 to 5 million in terms of client assets coming over. Now they can range anywhere between $10 to $30 million, right? Which again can vary in terms of kind of who the advisor might be working with. The second thing I think we see is kind of a little bit more qualitative is a lot of the feedback we get in terms of client retention, right? So what does this do in terms of either helping to close business up front or to ensure that the client is satisfied with the services the advisor is providing? And I think that's a huge thing because you almost kind of think about it as if someone has all their assets managing towards one direction for you in one place, right? It's going to be really hard to, want to think about unwinding that, right? Unless you have a really good reason relative towards your relationship with the advisor. And the third thing, which again, this kind of comes up with our clients, not so much because it's like the intelligence behind the scenes with what's happening, but it's just kind of a natural thing that comes up with what people want to see is some of it is about the reporting on what happens if I personalize an account or two around some ESG mandate or consideration. But I think the bigger thing is actually people just finally get a full view of what risk they're actually taking at the aggregate portfolio level, right? That's been something that I would say that our clients have seen a lot of success working with advisors to be able to go in as a part of that portfolio review and give them that view on like, okay, hey, here's all your accounts. Here's the risk for those accounts. But by the way, like when we put it all together, right, what's the risk you're actually taking at the aggregate view for your entire household, right? And I think that becomes very powerful because it can give a little bit of a sense of ease for the client on, I've hired to work with this advisor who's, guiding me along this journey and, everything that they've told me from a planning standpoint of what they want to do with my assets lines up. And so I think that's probably the more, let's call it other kind of more quantitative, slightly qualitative piece that we've seen as kind of how people are going back and coming back to us and saying, this is working, right? We really love kind of what possible, opportunity that this creates for our clients.
Yeah. So Joe, you are obviously a direct indexing expert and a risk management expert, but you've also built ETF and index products at such firms as Russell Investments and Schwab. So you're also an ETF expert. And some have said that direct indexing is going to be an ETF killer. How do you see the ETF versus direct indexing split evolving over the next 3 to 5 years?
So I actually see them being a little bit more hand in hand and working together, right? And again, some of this kind of goes back to my comments from where my mind was a couple of years ago versus today. Largely thinking that, hey, direct indexing is going to translate possibly into the great unbundling of ETFs, if you will. Mm-hmm. And, the reason why I say that, though, Rusty, in terms of why they're going to coexist and continue to coexist is that the one topic that they intersect pretty easily on is taxes, right? The idea, if you were an ETF investor, it was really all about, hey, I have access to something that, gets me diversified in terms of my portfolio. Oh, and by the way, I control my tax outcome because I'm not being distributed a capital gain year by year, typically, in terms of, being able to kind of manage that when I'm actually, realizing the actual gain of when I chose to come in and when I chose to go out. I think, if you were to say like, what are, if you're an advisor out there listening, what are really the growth rates and where they're going to exist? I think ETFs, certainly have gone down a pretty monumental kind of shift in growth. I think, and that's just passive in general as well. And you would naturally expect some of those growth rates to go down. But I think in certain cases, especially with like active ETFs, those growth rates are likely to continue to be a little bit more closer towards double-digit range than what you might have seen historically before. I think on the whole direct indexing, I kind of put it more as anything that relates towards comprehensive personalization with tax-aware investing. I think that growth trend is going to continue to be double digits for the foreseeable future. Folks like Cerulli, for example, have done a lot of really, really good work towards, surveying and kind of getting their own, quantitative data in place to better understand kind of where that trend's likely going. And I think it just has more to do with that in this day and age, technology has been the great enabler to, allow for a different series of conversations in this space than what we've had previously. So I see them both coexisting. I see ETFs becoming tools for comprehensive personalization with tax management. But I also think in general that over the next, 5 to 10 years, what we're really going to start seeing is kind of what I would describe more as, going from UMAs as being kind of 1.0 towards thinking about multiple models or strategies, multiple asset classes, and raising that bar up to unified managed householding, where a lot of that work still coexists, but also the thought where things can coexist in terms of being managed as one as well for the client.
Yeah. On a lot of podcasts, they ask a question. It's kind of a standard question. They do an overrated, underrated kind of question, which I love. We've never asked it on our podcast, but I'm going to ask it here now. And with direct indexing and personalized indexing, there are a lot of benefits. We've touched upon a couple of them.
Yep.
But what do you think is the most underrated advantage of direct indexing beyond tax loss harvesting? And probably the more difficult question, what do you think is the most overrated?
Yeah, that is such a tough question, Rusty. Because, there's a lot of benefits there. I think, so from my vantage point and where I sit in the world, I think one of the most underrated things, and I think this is largely because maybe people perceive this as being out of favor at this point. But, I think one of the most underrated things when it comes to direct indexing relates towards, sustainable investing and ESG investing, right? And the reason why I say that is one of the things that I think that kind of vein of kind of investment work, starts to get into really is how to take the client's own belief system and then imprint that in their own portfolio, right? And one of the things we see a lot of times is that doesn't often come up as being kind of the key driver for, especially in the way of a household, as being the dominant consideration for how the client wants to get invested, right? But again, it comes up with families that multi-generational in nature, and their children who might still be younger maybe have a trust account that's a couple $100,000. Like that's important to them. And so, the reason why I feel it's underrated, because it's a great tool to, often help advisors win over an entire mandate where the considerations on, something that could only make up maybe 10 to 15% of the total mandate itself. Right. And again, I think that all just goes back to people just want choice. They want the ability to, be, as I would describe, that co-pilot as a part of the overall investment experience with the advisor. One of the things I'm not going to call overrated, but it certainly feels becoming a little bit more like FOMO. And I still question it, like, okay, when is it appropriate? When is it not appropriate? It's a little bit more on this whole kind of discussion or talk on, tax aware, long, short, tax aware 130/30 strategies, things like that. And I think it has more to do with that, it's not really, I kind of look at it personally, it's not really intended to be for every single client out there, right? I think there's situations where it's appropriate, especially if somebody has a lot of embedded gains in a concentrated position, where it can be a great way to start, unwinding that in a sensible way to get the necessary diversification, help the client really minimize that tax bill. But, I think just with, frankly, and this is my own 2 cents, the conversation that a lot of folks have been having about this now, it almost feels like as if it's something people are considering to do as like the hot new thing, and, willing to apply it to any client situation, right? Which, we all know kind of how that goes in our industry when something's, applied and it's really not a good fit from us, whether it's, suitability or even, fiduciary standpoint. So I would call that, probably, I won't call it overrated, but it's certainly something I have a little bit of pause on personally in terms of its application.
All right. We do want to switch gears now to the other theme of our show, which is stronger living.
Yep.
So as a CIO, a former deputy CIO, One key role for you has been helping to define and defend an investment team's culture. So can you define culture in an investment firm for us? What behaviors and cadences actually start showing up in portfolios and in client experiences?
Yeah, so my thinking continues to evolve on this every day, just relative towards, now having this experience also as an entrepreneur. I look at kind of the idea or concept of culture. It's really kind of the glue that keeps everything together and, sets the tone for how a team moves forward together, both in good times as well as in, when there's turbulence, if you will. One of the things that I think for me personally, as I thought about culture, is that there's an element of that, and I'll kind of describe this as, there's an element that is all about fostering, not necessarily just, competition, but I think rather the ability for every member of the team to think about how they want to, focus on themselves, right, and improve, right? We all kind of, especially in this business, know that, getting from point A to point B often is, learning something new as we're going along our journeys. And so, I think part of that, my thinking over the last couple of years has really been, you have to find ways to just encourage people to explore and try something, right? Especially when it comes towards doing something new or innovative, right? And understanding it's perfectly okay to, fail, right? Just fail fast and keep moving forward. The second thing I think is also equally important is we often don't talk as much about well-being in the context of finding time for yourself outside of work, right? And what I mean by that is, I think back to my days as like a deputy CIO or as a portfolio manager. I was always go, 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 go. Right. I'm the type of person you could find me up probably 3 or 4 hours up before market open here in the US because I'm worried about what's happening in Asia overnight, or worrying about, the bond market and what's the implications for that. Fast forward the clock, I still largely deal with those things. We have clients, both here in the US as well as in Europe. And so that's important to me to make sure that we have coverage and are answering their questions. But, I think for myself personally, I found that, culture also has to encourage the ability for folks to really also kind of take their own self-care, mental health as being an equally top priority towards facilitating kind of how they continue down their journey, if you will. So for me personally, that translates a lot of time. I'm very intentional about things that are going to be important for my day outside of work, taking my daughter to daycare, taking my dog for a walk, just, taking a break and being able to go outside, and whether it's for a run or, just stand on my balcony and stretch overlooking the lake, things like that. So, I think that culture is one part about making sure, again, there's an openness to allow people to explore, be creative, to fail fast, and on the same side to allow and encourage for folks to really be focused on kind of self-care and, being able to take care of themselves over time.
So wait a second, you no longer send out emails at 3 a.m.?
Yeah, they probably now updated to maybe 5 a.m.
Okay. All right. Well, it sounds like you're becoming more of a human being than just being the machine that you were.
Yeah, that might be a part of it. Might be a part of parenthood as well.
I think that 3-year-old has a little bit to do with that.
Yeah.
Okay, so as an entrepreneur, what do you think has been one of the hardest lessons that you've learned moving from large platforms to building the company that you have? And do you have any advice for any other potential founders who might be listening today?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things that I've had to learn, overcome, is really, I would describe it more as overcoming fear. Right? And fear comes in a lot of forms when you're on this journey. Fear sometimes can translate in terms of hesitancy to, whether it's, do a cold reach out or, reach out to somebody you haven't, connected with in a while, to really see if there might be a possible opportunity to partner. Fear sometimes, I think, can also be in the form of wondering with every, entrepreneur journey, like, hey, are we going to make it? Are we going to fail? Are we doing enough to really confirm product market fit and things like that? And I think that one of the things that I've had to, take a step back and really appreciate, one is I think attitude, makes a world of difference towards kind of being able to overcome some of those fears. So having the attitude to say, hey, you never know what could happen, right? In terms of kind of getting an introduction, connecting with someone, I think that's important because you figure out pretty quickly we're all human beings, right? We can put on the professional facade, in terms of what we do, but I think a lot more people tend to connect on the concept or idea of, hey, we're all human beings, we're all trying to figure it out, and we're all open to new ideas, even if we haven't come across them before. And I think the second thing too is that sometimes you kind of have to take the step back, especially if you're a founder and kind of going down this path, to tell yourself sometimes, hey, there's things that are absolutely in your control, right? And you should do whatever it takes to control for those things. And then there's some things that are out of your control where sometimes you kind of have to just let it play out and react accordingly. And, for me, I think that's definitely brought my stress level down quite a bit sometimes because, you just realize that for the things you can control, sometimes it's just about a matter of saying, okay, hey, well, that didn't work out. Well, what's the next step, right? And often what you find out is that thing that didn't go through or the deal that didn't go through actually opens a lot of other doors you may not have anticipated, but were actually better for what you wanted to do to move your ball forward.
Yep. So I have to ask, as a former athlete, what does performance mean to you, both personally and professionally?
Yeah, so that's a good question because I kind of feel it's evolved a little bit. So, I think back, Rusty, especially like, for my background and kind of growing up and things that were important to me, I used to always think about it as like, being an athlete is all about competing against the next guy or next gal to you and whatever you're doing, right? And it could, for me, it always would translate, hey, it could be on the field, on the track, in a classroom, right? Going to more the professional side in a work setting. And, over time, that's kind of changed for me now where it's probably a bit more about me versus myself. And I kind of, have long had this mantra. It hasn't been recently, but just have long had this mantra probably over the last like 10 years or so, where competing is really, competing against myself and thinking about, hey, what's the one or two things I can do when I wake up in the morning to incrementally push myself to get better? The other, I think, component where as an athlete, you don't often think about these things. As a former athlete, you don't think about these things, but they become important as you move along, especially in your personal life or in your career, is going from more of the individual contributor towards being more of the teacher or coach. Right. And that's where I think I find the most joy these days is, coaching, folks I work with, or even thinking about passing along, knowledge that I've, garnered or, have collected over the years. And it's a different style of kind of, I wouldn't say competition, but rather just the way you kind of approach things. Because I think especially when people think about coaching, mentoring, or things like that, it's all about, you really just want to make sure that, that individual, as they're going through their journey, is like, they have a sounding board, right? To say, okay, hey, I haven't come across this. Like, what are the things that might be important, less important, right? And you give that advice freely without necessarily kind of thinking about, oh, if you don't do, or if you do something, there could be consequences one way or the other. You still give them like the ability to, let them retain that choice. But I think at least it gives them, a way to kind of update their point of view before they make a more informed decision.
So, Joe, I have one last question, and it kind of goes back to closing a loop because we kind of referred to this a couple times, but how do you achieve that work-life balance? You have a young family and your wife is also a high achiever. So what boundaries, schedules, or let's call it minimum effective doses keep you present and high energy?
So for me, it's being very intentional with my family and the people closest to me. So I'm the type of person that, especially like with my wife, we have a lot of very open communication about our schedules, our days, how do we support each other, how do we, pick up the slack where, one of us can't. And I think that is like what keeps me sane frequently a lot of times in terms of kind of going through all the things I do. The second thing I think also is I've been fortunate enough to be home more often than not, and seeing my daughter grow up and being able to participate with that process as well. And so, I kind of put it all together as like, one, be very intentional about, how you go about organizing your day. I think the second thing is picking kind of those closest to you first, right? And then letting everything else kind of work itself around that. So that's been my formula. It could be a little bit different for other folks, but it's definitely created a lot of calm and peace for me in the midst of all the turbulence.
Sounds like a good plan to me.
Yeah.
Be good. Well, Joe, it's been so good to see you and catch up and chat with you and hear all of your insights. We really appreciate you coming on the show. Before we let you go, though, can you tell us how can advisors follow your work and continue learning from you?
Yeah. So, I know Rusty brought this up before, but if folks ever have an interest to learn a little bit more about us, go to www.partipris-invest.com. You can also follow us on LinkedIn. We tend to post pretty frequently in terms of just thoughts, commentary, research that we're putting out there around the application of these style of tools and how they can benefit advisors, how they can simplify the discussion with their clients around householding and personalization. And then also, I'm a big fan. What I love about LinkedIn as well is like just the ability for people to reach out directly. And so if anybody has any questions, feel free, to reach out. You typically will find me under Joe Smith/CFA. And so, always happy to, have a conversation and learn a little bit more about your business and what you're trying to accomplish.
We will have those links in the show notes. And I do have to say the LinkedIn posts have been very high quality. And I've noticed you really picked up the pace on that. But Joe, I have two more questions.
Sure.
I know I said one later, but I have two more questions. We are publishing this podcast days before Thanksgiving. So the two questions which I think are important is in a couple of days, the University of Washington is playing University of Oregon. How do you size up that game? And related to that, as a University of Washington fan, are you embracing the Big Ten yet?
Yeah, I knew you would ask those questions, like just given this time of year. So yeah, I will, for anybody listening, first of all, I'm a University of Washington alum. And so I am very big on Go Huskies. As folks probably may or may not know as well, Oregon is one of our biggest rivalries historically, especially coming over from the Pac-12. I think it's going to be a much closer game than people are expecting, right? Yes, Oregon's one of the top ranked teams in the country or whatnot, but there's something about, playing at, Husky Stadium. Some people call it the greatest setting in college football for a reason. And, we had the benefit of being right on the water, beautiful backdrop of the lake and mountains, and just a lot of fans, what we call sailgating. So they'll tailgate on a boat.
And it's loud.
And it's loud. It's one of the loudest stadiums in the country. So, I think our odds are actually going to be pretty good. It's going to be a very close game. It always is. And so, if you're an Oregon fan, I'll say, hey, good luck. But, that could be a difficult situation as it's proven in the past. I think on the Big Ten, it's funny, Rusty, because I was talking with a friend about this who came up a couple weeks ago. We went to, it was Washington and Illinois, and we were just talking about how, us entering the Big Ten, it's been a little bit of a shotgun marriage, if you will. But I think we're starting to grow into it, right? It's we definitely have had some pretty pivotal games like Michigan, Ohio State. We're looking forward to playing Nebraska next year, right? I think that'll be fun, finally. But I think the move with the Pac, effectively a good chunk of the Pac-12 moving into the Big Ten, I think what's ultimately going to create is what I think down the road is going to be the college super conference, right? And I think it's going to grow even more to the point where possibly there's going to be divisions rather than just simply, two halves of the conference, and they, decide who goes to the championship game. But, it's been an interesting experience so far. I definitely wasn't expecting for us to make the national championship right before we entered into the Big Ten. But those games are always a crapshoot, each week. So it makes it a lot more fun.
Yeah. I mean, it's going to be so much harder to win conference championships with 18 teams. But basically, Robin and I, the way we see the world for college sports is that the only sport that really matters is volleyball anyway.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
I disagree. I got leaped into that involuntarily.
All roads lead to volleyball when you're talking sports in Nebraska these days.
Well, it's true. I mean, at least we like to win those games.
Yeah. Joe, thank you so much. As always, we really appreciate your wisdom and really great to see you.
Yeah, no, Rusty, thank you for having me. Robin, it's great to see you as well. I hope you both have a wonderful Thanksgiving and holiday season. I'm already gearing up between turkey and matching pajamas and everything else. So I'm definitely looking forward for this time of year.
Awesome. It sounds great to me. Thanks again, Joe.
All right. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Jim.
Yep.
We'll be back next week. Thanks for listening to Invest Well, Be Well. Let us know what you think. And if you like what you hear, don't forget to subscribe.
This podcast is hosted by Rusty Vanneman and Robin Murray and produced by Garrett Crosby.
If you have feedback, guest suggestions, or just want to connect, please visit my website, rustysbridge.com, or email me directly at rusty@rustysbridge.com. Until next time, invest well and be well. This episode of Invest Well, Be Well is brought to you by Bonrian Capital, led by my friend and colleague of nearly 10 years, Shana Sissel. Shana was named a top 20 wealth tech CEO in 2025, and it's no surprise. She's passionate, does the work, and knows asset managers, portfolio allocations, and alternatives like few others in the business. She's authentic, tough, and deeply cares about all her stakeholders, the kind of character you'd expect from the daughter of a police officer. If you want an investment manager who combines deep due diligence with innovative solutions and alternative investments, please check out Bonrian Capital at bonriancapital.com.